find out, like, basically what Alexander did was he came in, he conquered a bunch of stuff, and then he died. Right? Like, he didn't, he died before he could get stuff established. And so what happened was his generals, he didn't have an heir, so his generals all kind of divided it up, is what happened. And I'm not an expert in intertestamental period history, but this, from, basically there was this huge political struggle after that, and poor Israel was caught in the middle of that. So they ended up changing hands multiple times. Anybody in here from a Catholic background? Okay. So a lot of what's called the Apocrypha, which is in Catholic Bibles and in other Bibles, they've got additional books. You'll see in the Old Testament, there's like the book of Maccabees is in there. The book of Maccabees talks about the Maccabean revolts, and it's these brothers that are all have the last name Maccabee, and that is during that intertestamental period also, where the Jews are really struggling to try to keep their cultural identity in the face of Greek culture was so powerful in its influence, language, worship, philosophy, all of those things. And so the Jews are just struggling to try to keep their identity as a culture during that time. And then you add into that there's Egypt is coming in and causing issues, and it's just a really difficult time. So if we have this image of the intertestamental period being this kind of quiet, eerie silence, God's not talking for 400 years, that's not what it was like. Okay, it was not a fun time, and it was for the Jewish people particularly. It was crazy, and they were just trying to hang on kind of for dear life. So to understand the cultural and religious setting, first of all, Hellenism, which is used to refer to Greek culture. The spread of Greek culture, philosophy, language, and style that began with Alexander the Great continued through the Roman period. So at the end of kind of near like the last century BC is when the Romans came in and really put kind of the iron boot down. And the Greeks are still around, and the Greek language is still kind of the primary language. And a lot of Greek influence is still around, but the Romans are in power politically. So by the time the New Testament starts, we've had, the Persians have fallen, the Greeks have come in, the Romans have come in, and so it's a completely different setting as the Bible or as the Old Testament closes. So Alexander spread Hellenism to make his rule manageable. Imposing Greek culture on others made it possible for him to govern such a huge empire. So what happened was he conquered a huge part of the world. The reason why his influence stayed for so long, even after the Romans took over, is because he made everyone act like Greeks. And when everybody acts the same, they're easier to control. It's when you start letting people have things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and things like that it's a lot harder to manage them. Now it's an oppressive way to rule, right? But it works in terms of you get to keep control. So Greek influence spread across the entire spectrum of human society, from clothing to language, and then to things like religion and philosophy. So that's that blank there, religion. And it even influenced the Jewish religion as hard as they fought to keep it separate. Now, for a lot of people, Hellenism was an enlightenment compared to their own culture, because as we know, because we still have a lot of their architecture and stuff like that today, they were very advanced in scholarship, art, and medicine. So in some ways it was helpful. It elevated culture, but obviously you're dealing with a lot of human rights abuses and stuff like that too. But then for the Jews, it was an imposition and a curse, because immorality was rampant in Hellenism. Just think about, a culture, in Hellenistic culture, it was like totally fine. Homosexuality was like super common, right? So imagine that. Imagine some of the idolatry, also things like homosexuality, sexual immorality, the food laws, things like that coming in and just crashing into the Jewish culture, and just how startling that would be. Like wow. And not only that, but the Greeks are like, no, you have to do these things. And they would do things like they would force Jews to eat pork. Because obviously that's an unclean animal for them. But it's like if they could do that, force them at a certain point to make themselves unclean, then maybe they would be like, okay, fine, I'll just become Greek. And so a lot of things like that. Now here lies the problem for the Jews, because Hellenism has become a huge dividing factor. That's that link there, for the once unified people who sought to follow the old covenant. Some Jews accepted and desired Hellenism, others rejected it and fought against it. So that's when you see a lot of the different factions of Judaism in Jesus' time, which we'll get into here in a minute. A lot of it was around this issue of how much like the Greeks and the Romans are we going to be, and how much are we going to follow our own identity. So Judaism in the time of Jesus, by the time of the New Testament, the Jewish faith was far different than 400 years prior. You see, we don't get that because we just jump straight from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And we miss out on some of these cultural things that have shifted. The better we understand those, the more we're like, oh, okay, it makes sense why Jesus is always, getting into fights with the Pharisees. You notice that? Okay. Well, where did the Pharisees come from? Well, they came from that time in between the Testaments. Okay. What's the deal with the Sanhedrin? Where did the Sanhedrin come from? The Sanhedrin is, constantly throwing the early Christian leaders into jail. Well, that came from the time in between the Testaments. When that Sanhedrin was established. What about synagogues? Jesus is teaching in the synagogue. Paul's going to different, cities, and he's always going into the synagogue and preaching. Where did synagogues come from? What's the deal with synagogues? Intertestamental period is where synagogues came from. So there's a lot of things we just kind of take for granted in the New Testament, but those showed up in between and during that 400 years of silence in between the two Testaments. So it's kind of helpful to study some of that sometimes. So that next line there, the exile and utter defeat of the Jewish nation, which was, as we saw, was when the two nations fell. It took many Jews out of their homeland. And that's that blank. When Jesus walked the earth, more Jews lived outside of Israel than inside Israel. So you got to imagine Jews being everywhere, from Alexandria in Egypt over to Rome and Ephesus and places like that. There's Jewish people everywhere. So they didn't have a temple to worship God, right? Because they're all spread out. They had to find new ways to worship and keep their identity as a people. And there two major developments occurred. Learning and studying the Torah became the highest calling for a Jew. So all of a sudden there's this it's less focused on worship as far as sacrifices and ceremonial stuff and things like that, and more of a focus on studying, learning. So that more than you see all throughout the Old Testament, it's less about, how am I ceremonially clean or unclean, the role of the priests and all that kind of stuff. That's still there, but mostly it's like studying. Okay. Also, the synagogue was created and became the place to worship instead of the temple. For worship, animal sacrifices were replaced by learning. Now, there's still sacrifices happening, but not to the level that they were in the Old Testament. On the Sabbath, people would go to the synagogue and they would learn. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, so describe what the Torah is.
Yes. So the Torah is specifically the first 5 books of the Bible, and then the interpretation of that. So what you had was you had the rabbinical system, the rabbis, and you would learn from rabbis, and each rabbi had a different interpretation of the law. They had some things in common, but they would have, maybe they would have a more liberal interpretation of the law, or a more conservative interpretation of the law, or they would have certain things that they were more focused on than others. So Jesus was a rabbi in the sense that he had a particular interpretation of the law. And so your followers, your disciples, as a rabbi, would take on your same interpretation. So, and actually, when they talk about their interpretation of the Torah, they would call it their yoke. And so when Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden," right? "My yoke is easy." He's talking about his interpretation, right? He's talking about your life, but he's also talking about, the way that he approaches following God is easy, meaning it fits well, which makes sense because he's the one who wrote it in the first place, right? So obviously his interpretation is going to have the best kind of connection with humanity. But so that's what's going on. So when I talk about the Torah is the Pentateuch, like the law and that kind of stuff. But it's more than that. It's also the interpretation of that. So, okay. Without these developments, the culture and beliefs of the Jewish people could have been lost to history. That's that link there. These changes ensured the survival of the Jewish culture and identity. Just to understand that a lot of the things that Jesus encounters and the first Christians encountered as far as the Jewish faith goes was a reaction to try to hang on to their identity as a people. That's really what I'm trying to get at. To understand that's why those things started. So then you've got movements like the Pharisees, who were very focused on following the law in terms of ceremonial cleanliness, right? Not so concerned with the temple and temple worship. Then you've got the Sadducees, who were a lot more concerned about temple worship and those kind of things. The Essenes, who were very focused on preserving the law and also just really seeking a high level of purity. Now, they're not mentioned by name in the New Testament, but you can see their influence. And then you've got the Zealots, who are very political, and were more about the political identity of the Jewish people and how they should be their own nation. They should not be being ruled by Rome. And so they're the ones that would take up arms against the Roman government. And actually, one of Jesus' followers, Simon, was a zealot, which must have been kind of interesting when Matthew joined the disciples who worked for the Roman government as a tax collector. I wonder what kind of conversations those two guys had. But so you just got, what's cool with Jesus' followers, you see a good cross-section of these different types of Judaism. But the bottom line is, it was pretty fragmented. Okay, the Jewish culture was not. You can't just make one categorical statement and say Jewish culture was like this, because there was a lot of different types of Jewish culture back then.
Where did sacrificing come in? How did that happen? What's the history of that?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because we didn't talk about that, which should we? All throughout the Old Testament, there is examples of like Jacob building an altar and sacrificing an animal, making an offering. Even all the way back to Cain and Abel, right? Abel brings an animal from his flock. Cain and Abel being the first two children of Adam and Eve. Abel brings an animal from his flock, and Cain brings offerings from his fields, because he was a farmer. And so you've got sacrifice all the way back then. But then you've got, in the Jewish laws, God sets up particular sacrifices. This is a burnt offering sacrifice. This is a sin offering. This is a wave offering, what that looks like, and setting up all these different types of offerings that they would do in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. The most important one probably being on the Day of Atonement, that there was a sacrifice that happened, and then the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle the blood of that animal on the Ark, the covenant. And then also they would have a live animal that was a goat, and it was called the scapegoat. And the priest would pray and put symbolically put all the sins of the people on that goat. And then they would send that goat out into the wilderness, out of the camp. And it was like God was removing their sins. That's where we get the idea of scapegoat. But there's all these sacrifices, this whole sacrificial system that's based around the priests. I don't know if that answers your question. But
so where did Cain and Abel get the idea then, I guess?
Exactly. I don't know. I feel like it's so for as far as the law goes, God initiates those sacrifices, and He's trying to show people that when it comes down to it, our sin costs us something, right? And just to give us an idea of gravity and weight to our sin. And then when Jesus dies on the cross, Hebrews talks about that sacrifice being once for all, and Jesus being the perfect sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice. But as far as where, pre-law, where did people get the idea that they should sacrifice an animal? A lot of cultures would do that to their other gods. And so I don't know, they thought, oh, well, I'll just do this. I'll do what, I see the other cultures doing. And God kind of came in and made that more systematic. I don't know. Or if they just felt compelled, like I should offer something to God, and well, I've got these animals. I don't know. It's kind of an interesting thought, isn't it? Yeah.
I was going to say, that was kind of something I struggled with a lot, but when you look, God wasn't always condoning of it. He wasn't satisfied with it, and that kind of leading to Jesus.
Sure.
It might have been a remnant, like you said, of some other cultural thing that just kind of got drafted into early Christianity.
And that brings up another thing that I think is important to keep in mind, and that is sometimes in the Old Testament we get color commentary about what God thinks about something. Like when King David sins with Bathsheba, it tells the whole story, and at the very, very end of the whole story, it says that the thing that David had done greatly displeased the Lord, right? And then God sends Nathan to go talk to David. But so we get a little glimpse of, hey, God didn't like any of this. Okay? But then you've got other stories, like there's one at the end of the book of Judges. It's a horrific story about there's a concubine, and the concubine ends up getting killed, and then a guy cuts his concubine up and mails it to all the different nations of Israel and says, hey, this is an injustice, and people rise up, and it's a horrible story. Like there's no redeeming characters in it at all. It's like what's going on here? And God doesn't say anything about, yeah, I thought this is great, or I hate this. Like we don't know, And so yeah, it's a great point. We don't always. Sometimes we're left to wonder, did God approve of this or not? Because He doesn't say one way or the other. And so sometimes the Old Testament tells us, and sometimes it doesn't. We can kind of make judgment calls based on other things that God doesn't like, but it's kind of left up to us to do that. So as far as sacrifices goes, we do know that it seems like God prompted Abel and Cain to bring sacrifices. It does seem like that he prompted them to do that, and then He looks on favor with Abel's and not on Cain's, and then Cain gets jealous, right? I will tell you, the first example we have of a sacrifice in the entire Bible is when Adam and Eve sin. They immediately feel shame, right? And they realize they're naked, and so they try to sew fig leaves together and to cover themselves. And it says that God kills an animal and clothes them with the skin of that animal. That's the first record we have in the Bible of an animal dying in order to cover, so to speak, the shame and sin of a human. And so maybe it started there. Maybe that was the first sacrifice, and so at least the killing of that animal, I've got clothes now, I don't need the skin of the animal to cover my nakedness, but I can still sacrifice the animal symbolically, for my sin. Maybe that's what it is. I don't know. That's a really great question. In any case, God did command sacrifices to happen in the Mosaic Law, but when the temple was destroyed in AD 70, which is after the time of most of the Old Testament or New Testament was written, the temple was intact, but then in AD 70, the Romans finally came in and destroyed the temple, and it hasn't been rebuilt since. So there has been no Jewish sacrificial system at all since AD 70, but I would say that it was probably already on its way out by the time of Jesus, because most Jews didn't live in Jerusalem. Most of them lived outside of Jerusalem, so they were part of the sacrificial system anyway. Does that make sense? Okay. Good question. Life of Jesus, as far as the ins and outs of the life of Jesus, you guys have a timeline for that, which is the one that's got the New Testament and on one side, kind of big picture, and then it's got the ministry of Jesus on the other side. So we're just going to focus on, do some snapshots of the miracles of Jesus, Old Testament prophecies about Jesus, and then the teachings of Jesus. And that'll be what we cover there. So the miracles of Jesus, just talking about miracles for a second here. Miracles are acts of God that deviate from our understanding of the laws of nature. That's that blank. Deviate from the laws of nature. Obviously, God wrote the laws of nature. He can do with it what He wants to do. Right? So that's what miracles are. Jesus used miracles to increase or create the faith of other people. So, when it talks about Jesus doing miracles, Jesus didn't come just to heal people, right? When Jesus does something, a miracle, a healing, or what's called a nature miracle, He is trying to make a point. Okay, that's usually what He's trying to do. He's trying to either reinforce something He's teaching, get people to pay attention. He's always got some kind of an agenda going on. He wasn't just arbitrarily walking around healing people because He felt bad for them. Okay, there's a reason behind it. There were sick people when Jesus walked the earth. There were sick people after Jesus walked the earth, and so it wasn't just about healing them in themselves. Miracles are proof that Jesus was from God. They're snapshots of the supernatural, allowing us to see God's glory. And then here you have a list of nature miracles and healing miracles. What's kind of fun is to look at the two other characters we have in the Bible that have this kind of traveling thing where they're going around doing a lot of miracles is Elijah and Elisha. That most of their ministry has to do with they go around and they do miracles. And it's interesting to see a lot of parallels between Jesus' miracles and the miracles of Elijah and Elisha. Lots of similarities there in terms of resurrections and nature miracles and things like that. So you can see the list there. We won't go through all those, but just to give you kind of an idea of what he did. Okay? Any questions? Comments? Okay. All right, let's talk about Old Testament prophecies. Jesus fulfilled over 300 different prophecies written in the Old Testament about what the Messiah would do. Over 300 prophecies. Just want to talk for a moment about the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. By the way, I printed more copies of the N.T. Wright article and the Dead Sea Scrolls booklet if you want those. Dead Sea Scrolls, maybe the most important archaeological find of all time. I don't know. Definitely as far as biblical archaeology goes. And a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls don't have anything to do with the Bible. Okay, there's scrolls about other stuff. It's not just all Bible books. But you just look at this. The Dead Sea Scrolls are ancient Hebrew documents that contain large portions of the Old Testament. Here's why this is significant. We might get into this more later if we have time about the collection of the Bible. Somebody was asking me a question. Is that you? You're asking me a question right there. So, there's the whole idea of where did we get the Old Testament? How was the Old Testament collected? Well, for a long, long time, the Old Testament that we had, that we were working with, and in fact is the one that's quoted by the New Testament. Anytime the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it's quoting what's called the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation of the Old Testament that was made, I think it was made like 300 BC, maybe a little bit after that. 250 to 200 BC, so 200 years before Christ. The Hebrew scriptures, remember the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew and Aramaic, was translated into Greek. And that was the only Old Testament that we had pretty much for, that they had, I guess you should say, for years and years and years, right? And even the, as far as the early translations of the Old Testament and stuff like that, the quoting of it in the New Testament, all the Septuagint. So the Hebrew scriptures, we have like bits and fragments of it, but not a lot. Then they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which goes along with a lot of the other Hebrew scriptures and stuff that we already had, and really filled that out quite a bit. And why that's important is The Dead Sea Scrolls date back to 250 years before Jesus. So Dead Sea Scrolls are ancient Hebrew documents that contain large portions of the Old Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls date back to 250 years before Jesus. The scrolls contain hundreds of prophecies about Jesus, mostly Isaiah. One of the things they found was pretty much a complete copy of Isaiah. It's called the Isaiah Scroll. And the oldest Old Testament evidence that we have was written 2 centuries after Jesus. And what that means written after is it means copied after. Okay? In terms of evidence resurfacing. Does that make sense? So we have the Septuagint, the Greek translation of those Hebrew scriptures, but not the Hebrew scriptures themselves, evidence of those until a couple hundred years after Jesus. And then as far as a complete Hebrew Old Testament being collected in one place, we didn't have that until the 11th century AD. So what that does is that leaves, the oldest complete Hebrew Old Testament was written 10 centuries after Jesus. That's that final link there. I know I'm kind of piecemealing this out. What that basically means is prophecies about Jesus, key prophecies about Jesus. Until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, people could still make the accusation that, well, those were just written down after Jesus lived. Okay, so somebody saw what Jesus did and changed those prophecies in the Old Testament to fit and match up with what Jesus did, so it would look like he fulfilled those prophecies. And a prophecy, this is that last blank on page 29. A prophecy isn't very authoritative if it was written after the events in which it was written, obviously, right? But the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated before Jesus, contain the same prophecies about Jesus. And guess what? When they got the Dead Sea Scrolls, compared them to the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, pretty close, like surprisingly close, considering how many years have passed and how much opportunity there was for changes to happen, even just by mistake, not even intentional, and really, really, really close. And it was awesome because it showed just how dependable the Septuagint really was, and how good of a translation it was from the original Hebrew. So, okay, that was fun. All right, huge idea on page 30. Fulfilled prophecy. What does this mean? Okay, this is a huge concept that we need to talk about, because I don't know if you guys have noticed this. Have you guys noticed that sometimes you read the Bible, you read the New Testament, and they'll quote it and they'll say, and that's why it said in the Old Testament, and then it quotes the Old Testament. And I read it and I go, that's not what, and I go back and I read it, that's not what that was talking about. Sometimes it seems like the way the New Testament quotes the Old Testament is pretty sketchy. Like, if I went around saying some of the things about the Old Testament that the New Testament says, people would be like, no, I think you're taking that out of context. I don't think that's quite right. And I've noticed that for a long time it bugged me. How is it that the New Testament writers can get away with quoting the Old Testament like that? That just seems really irresponsible. Look at this. The virgin will conceive and bear a son, and we'll call him Emmanuel. Well, that happened when Jesus was born, but it also, in some sense, was a sign to Ahaz back in that day. So it had a meaning then, has a fuller meaning now. All right. Here's another one, also from the birth of Jesus. So he got up, talking about Joseph, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt. Why are they going to Egypt? Trying to escape Herod. Yep. So where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Okay? Where did that come from? It comes from Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Now, is it talking about Jesus? What's that talking about? It's interesting because there's so many levels of meaning. Remember earlier we were talking about layers of meaning for prophecy. In this case, this prophecy has like 4 layers of meaning. Because when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. It could be talking about the Exodus, right? It could be talking about the king. Often the king was called the Son of God. It could be talking about Jesus, right? And then, as we see in Corinthians, Paul is relating our own spiritual journey to the journey of the people in the wilderness. It could be talking about us. So there's so many layers of meaning in that prophecy, but we only get to see those layers when we look back through the lens of Jesus. Listen, Jesus was the greatest teacher who ever lived. So we could talk all day long about how amazing Jesus was. We're just going to talk about it for like 5 minutes. So parables. Parable comes from a combination of words that literally means to throw alongside. Okay, that's what parable means. Basically, you take a historical story. It might not be a true story. It probably isn't, but it could happen. Okay, there's no like talking animals in it or anything like that. And you throw it alongside a truth. So you've got the truth, you've got the story, you throw it alongside and describe situations that were familiar to original hearers. So when Jesus talks about the parable of the sower, he's throwing seeds. Okay, people see that all the time, they understand that. He talks about the parable of the prodigal son. Okay, it's an experience that a lot of parents have had where their child decides to make their own, they decide to rebel, they decide to go away or whatever. And so that had emotional resonance for Jesus' listeners. Or parable of the Good Samaritan. He started talking about, man went to travel from Jerusalem to Jericho. People immediately knew that road is sketchy, man. Like, that is a scary road. You walk that road, there's rocks. Okay, you don't know what's going to happen. There could be people hiding behind that. You don't want to travel that at night or whatever. People understood. Okay, and so it was all really applied to their culture and their place. So, yeah. Parables are different from allegories in that every detail in the story doesn't necessarily have a hidden meaning. So we could go off on that, but just don't allegorize parables. They don't always have every single thing has a meaning. Why did Jesus use parables? Let's talk about what are some of the reasons. You guys go ahead and give me some feedback. Why would Jesus teach in parables? Why would he choose to teach that way? Okay. How does it help?
I don't know, I dump it down,
Okay. Yeah, relatable, it illustrates. Yeah, definitely.
Comparable. It can compare to something.
Okay, good.
You can take complex ideas and make them simple.
That's good. Yep, totally.
People like stories.
People like stories. Stories are great. As soon as somebody starts telling a story, we lean in and listen. More so than, hey, I'm going to tell you to find that. Anybody else?
Could be generalized to a lot of different situations.
Yeah, definitely. You can take it and apply it a lot of different ways. Yeah, I was just talking to last Thursday to a guy about how Jesus as a teacher kind of gives me panic attacks as a teacher because he would leave so much up to the listener. Like he'd just throw it out there, and like it was up to people. He would say a lot. He who has ears, let him hear. Right? Jesus says that all the time. It's like, no. You can't leave it up to them. They're not going to figure it out. You can't, And as a teacher, I'm going, I think I tend to come in and rescue people a little too quickly. I'm going to tell you the answer. I'm going to help you out, And Jesus is like, no. He just throws it out there. If you want to respond, you're going to respond. If you don't respond, then that's on you, right? Yeah.
It's kind of, again, not imposing on you that wisdom, but making you kind of curious and want to seek more. Because all over the place it's telling you, if you want it, I'll give it to you. But it kind of prompts you to dig.
Yeah. I wonder sometimes when we think about God when we have this picture of God being very demanding, if we've gotten that from humans and not from the picture the Bible gives us. Because Jesus, reflects the heart of God, right? He's representative of the heart of God, and I think you see, what does he do? Sometimes he's pretty upfront, he's pretty straightforward with people. Other times, he puts it out there, and it's up to you. And a lot of times, the people that got it are the people that were ready to hear that. The people that didn't get it were the people that weren't ready to hear it. Which is the other reason why Jesus would speak in parables. Sometimes it was to keep the message hidden from those who weren't ready to hear it yet. So yeah, those two things are parables are easy to remember, and then to communicate truth to believers, but to hide it from people with hard hearts. Okay. All right, let's talk about the kingdom of God. So, what is the kingdom of God? Have you guys ever struggled with this concept before? Is this something you guys have wondered about before? Okay. Big, huge concept in what Jesus talks about. The term kingdom of God captures all that Jesus was about. That's that first point. Captures all that Jesus was about. His identity, his ministry, and his teaching. The kingdom of God is, here's a definition for you. The kingdom of God is everything that is under God's rule and has God's presence. That's the kingdom. Jesus refers to the kingdom, and Paul talks about the kingdom a little bit here and there. Not nearly as much as it's talked about in the Gospels, but the kingdom is that. It's anything that's under God's rule and has God's presence. Where, so we can kind of ask, where is the kingdom of God? Well, the kingdom of God right now is the rule of God in the heart. That's where the kingdom of God primarily exists. It's moral, attitudes and actions, and not legal, meaning actions only. And what I mean by that is think about all the times that Jesus talks about the heart. Right? When he talks about what comes out of a mouth is what out of our mouths is what makes a man unclean. Not, not like eating certain foods or whatever. It's about the heart. Or you think about the Sermon on the Mount, where he's talking about, oh well, don't commit adultery. Don't kill somebody. Jesus goes, I'm going to back that up. If you lust after somebody, same thing as adultery. If you hate somebody in your heart, same thing as murder. Why? Because it's heart level. This is about our moral lives, not just legally if we can be held responsible or not. So that is the kingdom. It's spiritual, not physical, but it does actually exist. It's not a dream. That's that other right there. The kingdom of God is something that is already in existence. It's not something that is future or a vision or something like that. It really is here. And it is anything and everything that's under God's rule and has God's presence. That's what the kingdom is. So, in terms of the rule of God in the world, the kingdom of God is reflected in the community, not in individuals only. The church is the most obvious and primary manifestation of the kingdom. You look around, you see the church. That's the most visible evidence that the kingdom of God is here. The kingdom of God is happening. Because you've got groups of people that are seeking God together, right? Groups of people where God is ruling and God's presence is there. It's for every person, not just a select few. And it exists now, yet it is not fully here. Which is what a lot of the Old Testament is dealing with, that tension. When Paul is writing letters, when Peter's writing letters, when John's writing letters, the book of Revelation is all about that tension of it's here, the kingdom is here, but we can tell it's not fully here yet. Because Jesus is not physically ruling this world yet. He's ruling in our hearts, he's ruling in the church, the kingdom of God is advancing, and the church is growing, expanding, but there's still things that happen in this world that are not God's will, and obviously not under God's rule yet, or under Jesus' rule specifically. So, when is the kingdom of God? The kingdom of God is here now because it came with Jesus, and it currently exists within every believer. The kingdom is not yet fully here because there are people without the kingdom, and Jesus has not yet returned. So that point there. And the kingdom of God that is here now is an anticipation and a guarantee of the kingdom to come. So it's not here yet fully, but it will be. It's not an if, but a when. Does that make sense? So it's a certain thing. It's going to happen. The kingdom will be fully established. It just hasn't happened yet. Okay. Now, next time you're reading, Jesus, and you see him talking about the kingdom of God is like, and now you have the context of what he's talking about. Questions? Okay. Book of Acts. Now we get into that fourth move. We've gone from creation and fall into redemption as far as Israel goes. Now redemption as far as Jesus goes. As we know, Jesus comes. He is reflective of the heart of God. He comes and he teaches and he heals and he ministers. And then he's arrested, crucified, His followers all scattered. They're, as far as everybody's concerned, it's over. Okay, done deal. By the way, Rome killed people regularly who were leading rebellions against Rome, and those rebellions died when the leader died. Right? Gone. You never hear about it. It happened all the time. Okay, that's why crucifixion was invented in the first place. Cut the head off the snake in the rebellion. Right? And Jesus was just another leader as far as Rome was concerned, and they got rid of him. And as far as they're concerned, it's over. And as far as Jesus' followers are concerned, it's over. Right? There's no reason the church should have kept going from that point forward. There's no reason we should be here today, other than the resurrection. There is literally no other explanation. It just doesn't make historical sense that we're sitting here without a resurrection. It was over, people. You hear what I'm saying? Over. And the disciples were gone. They were running scared. They're not going to come back together and, hey, we should all pretend like Jesus rose from the dead. We should all live our lives. We should all get persecuted and die for our faith. It'll be a fun game, right? Over. And yet, here we are. So, something happened.